It was in the stark late autumn of 1944, deep within the American heartland, that the transport train, a beast of iron and steam, finally shuddered to a halt. For Kenji, a young soldier barely past his 20th year, who had faced the fury of Saipan, this journey inward had been a descent into a new kind of hell. He had braced himself for the biting cold of American vengeance, the starvation, the inevitable, dehumanizing cruelty that propaganda had promised awaited those who succumbed to the enemy. His mind, honed by years of unwavering loyalty and the rigid doctrines of Bushido, saw only the ultimate disgrace in his survival, a stain on his family, a betrayal of the emperor. He expected to find a barren, hostile land, a reflection of the enemy's barbarity. Yet, as he stepped onto the gravel, blinking against an unfamiliar pale sunlight, the air did not carry the stench of blood or despair, but a faint, almost sweet aroma of cooked meat and an unsettling quietude. The camp itself, a sprawling collection of wooden barracks and barbed wire fences stretching further than his eyes could comfortably comprehend, was disturbingly orderly. The ground was tamped earth, not the scarred mud of battlefields. The guards, tall and strangely relaxed, moved with an almost casual efficiency, their uniforms surprisingly clean. This was not the chaotic, desperate enemy he had been taught to despise. It was something disturbingly mundane, unsettling in its very lack of expected brutality. The sheer scale of it all, the endless rows of identical structures, the distant hum of unseen machinery, spoke of a power he had not fully grasped. Here, in this confined world, the sounds were not the expected screams or the rattle of chains, but the distant murmur of voices, the clatter of mess tins, and occasionally the unfamiliar rhythmic clang of something mechanical from beyond the fences. Within hours, the first truly perplexing event unfolded. After a meager but surprisingly warm meal, a strange, savory stew unlike anything he knew, the guards began distributing small, dark bottles. Kenji watched, bewildered, as each man, including his own weary companions, was offered one. He heard the word beer from the American guards, a sound he did not recognize, yet the gesture itself was baffling. He had anticipated punishment, perhaps even forced labor, but certainly not this peculiar offering. His comrade, old Sato, who had seen more seasons than Kenji had years, merely grunted and pushed his bottle away, a silent act of defiance. Others followed suit, their faces etched with suspicion, their pride a visible barrier. Was this a trick? A poison? A means to weaken their resolve before some harsher torment? The very idea of the enemy offering something akin to a pleasure, something so utterly detached from the expected harshness of captivity, was a profound cultural shock. It contradicted every lesson, every ingrained belief about their adversaries. Kenji, however, felt a flicker of something else. A strange, almost involuntary curiosity. He had been taught that the enemy was devoid of honor, driven by a brutal, materialistic spirit. Yet this simple bottle, cool to the touch, felt real. He remembered the strictures against accepting anything from the enemy, the shame of indulgence. But the aroma of the stew still lingered in the air, a testament to an unexpected provision, and the guards, for all their watchfulness, seemed merely indifferent to the refusals. One young guard, barely older than Kenji himself, merely shrugged when Sato refused, placing the bottle gently on the ground beside him. There was no anger, no coercion, just a quiet, almost paternalistic persistence that was deeply unsettling. The absence of expected cruelty was itself a form of psychological warfare, chipping away at the rigid framework of his understanding. He found himself staring at the bottle, its dark glass reflecting the weak afternoon light, a small, tangible enigma in this bewildering new reality. The dark glass of the bottle seemed to hold more than just liquid. It contained a silent challenge to everything Kenji had ever known. He watched the young American guard move down the line, offering the same baffling item, meeting refusals with that same unsettling indifference. There was no menace in the guard's eyes, only a weary patience. The absence of expected anger was a more potent weapon than any threat. Finally, with a tremor of defiance against his own ingrained fear, Kenji reached out, his fingers brushing the cool, damp glass. The guard offered a barely perceptible nod, a flicker of something almost like approval, before moving on. Kenji held the bottle, a small, heavy cylinder, its label unreadable, its contents a mystery. He remembered the teachings. The enemy's gifts were poison, their kindness a snare. Yet the stew had been warm, the bread soft, and no one had fallen ill. He twisted the cap, a metallic pop echoing unnaturally in the quiet barracks, and a strange, yeasty aroma wafted up. Hesitantly, he brought it to his lips. The first taste was bitter, alien, sharp on his tongue, utterly unlike sake or any drink he had ever known. He expected revulsion, but then a surprising effervescence, a crispness that cut through the lingering taste of the unfamiliar stew. It was cold, refreshing, and profoundly disorienting. He took another sip, then another, the liquid slowly warming in his mouth, the metallic tang giving way to a more complex, earthy flavor. Old Sato, from his bunk, watched with an unreadable expression, his face a mask of silent judgment. But Kenji could not look away from the bottle, from this small, potent symbol of a world he had been taught to despise. The days that followed deepened this quiet disorientation. The camp, far from being the desolate prison he had envisioned, functioned with an almost unsettling efficiency. Each morning brought a hot, if monotonous, breakfast. The barracks, though simple, were sturdy and surprisingly warm against the encroaching chill of the American autumn. There were designated areas for washing, latrines that were cleaned daily, and even a small, rudimentary infirmary where sick men were treated by American medics with a detached but undeniable competence. Kenji, who had expected deprivation and disease, found instead a bewildering abundance of the very basics of life. He observed the trucks that rolled in each day, laden not with weapons or chains, but with sacks of flour, crates of tinned goods, and fresh vegetables. An almost unimaginable scale of provision. This was not the starving, desperate enemy. This was a nation that produced so much, so effortlessly, that even its prisoners were fed with a regularity that shamed the memory of the meager rations he had known in the field. The sheer logistical power, the industrial capacity implied by such consistent supply, began to chip away at the edifice of his understanding. He had been taught of a decadent, weak enemy, but decadence did not produce such organized abundance, and weakness did not sustain such an operation. One afternoon, while mending a torn uniform, Kenji found himself next to another prisoner, a man named Hiroshi, older, with weary eyes that seemed to have seen too much. Hiroshi, unlike Sato, had also taken the beer. He spoke quietly, his voice a low murmur. "They have so much," he said, not in wonder, but in a tone of bleak resignation. "Look at this place. No one starves. No one freezes. Even their guards. They do not seem to hate us." Kenji merely grunted, unable to form a response, but the words resonated. He had seen the guards, their faces sometimes bored, sometimes curious, but rarely hostile. The young guard who had offered him the beer often stood near their barracks, and one day he paused, not speaking, but humming a strange, unfamiliar tune, a melody both melancholic and strangely hopeful. It was a brief, unguarded moment, a glimpse into an ordinary human life that was supposed to be his enemy's. This was not the savage foe depicted in the posters, but merely men, some young, some older, performing a duty. That evening, as the barracks settled into a restless quiet, Kenji pulled out a small, folded photograph from his tunic pocket, a treasured image of his mother and younger sister, their faces smiling, framed by the familiar landscape of his village. He traced the outline of his mother's face, recalling her stern but loving lessons, her pride in his service. He thought of the emperor, of Bushido, of the honorable death he had been prepared to embrace. And then he thought of the camp, of the warm stew, the strange bittersweet beer, the distant humming melody of the guard, and the endless trucks of food. The photograph, once a source of unwavering resolve, now seemed to deepen the internal chasm opening within him. The world he had left behind, the world of absolute truths and clear enemies, felt distant, almost unreal, like a dream fading with the morning light. The reality here, in its baffling normalcy, in its quiet abundance, was a betrayal of every expectation, a silent, relentless dismantling of the very foundations of his identity. He felt a profound sense of loneliness, not for his family, but for the certainty he had once possessed. The beer, he realized, had not been a poison for his body, but for his mind, dissolving the rigid lines of his belief. The quiet hum of the camp, a constant counterpoint to the memories of artillery and shouts, became Kenji's new reality. Each day brought a fresh series of small, mundane revelations. The meticulous organization extended beyond just food. There were regular inspections of the barracks, not for signs of rebellion, but for cleanliness, for order. Blankets were folded precisely, personal effects neatly arranged. It was a bizarre, almost domestic discipline, utterly at odds with the brutal, chaotic image of the enemy he had carried. The guards, in their unhurried patrols, sometimes carried small, dark devices to their ears, speaking into them in low tones, a strange, incomprehensible technology that hinted at a vast, unseen network of communication and control. It was not the desperate scramble of a nation fighting for its survival, but the measured, almost bored efficiency of an industrial giant. He spent hours observing the younger American guard, the one who had offered him the beer. This guard, often stationed near their section, would sometimes lean against a fence post, gazing out beyond the wire, his face devoid of animosity, sometimes even betraying a wistful melancholy. One crisp morning, as the sun began to warm the frost-laced ground, Kenji watched him pull a small leather-bound book from his pocket, its pages worn. The guard opened it, not to read, but to gaze at a faded photograph tucked within. He traced its edges with a thumb, a gesture so profoundly human, so universal in its quiet sorrow, that it pierced through Kenji's hardened defenses. This man, an enemy, was not a faceless demon, but a person capable of private longing, of memory, just like himself. The propaganda had stripped them of their humanity, and in turn, had stripped him of his own capacity for empathy. The realization was a cold, sharp blade to his heart. Later that week, a new shipment arrived. Not just food, but crates of clothing, thick woolen socks, and sturdy boots, all distributed with the same indifferent efficiency. Kenji held a new sock, its weave surprisingly soft, its warmth a stark contrast to the threadbare remnants of his uniform. This simple act of provision, seemingly minor, spoke volumes. It was not charity, nor a trap, but a practical measure from a nation that possessed an almost unimaginable surplus. How could an enemy, supposedly facing its own privations, afford such abundance for its prisoners? The sheer scale of it, the constant flow of goods, the well-maintained vehicles that brought them. It was a silent, irrefutable argument against everything he had been taught. His homeland, for all its fierce pride and sacrifice, had struggled to feed its own soldiers adequately, let alone its captured enemies. The comparison was a bitter draught, more potent than any beer. He found himself seeking out Hiroshi, the older prisoner whose weariness carried a different kind of wisdom. Hiroshi rarely spoke of the past, but his observations of the present were sharp. "They do not hate us as we were taught to hate them," Hiroshi murmured one evening, watching the distant lights of the camp administration buildings flicker against the darkening sky. "They merely see us as a problem to be managed, a logistical challenge." He paused, then added, "It is a different kind of war for them, Kenji. A war of machines and endless resources, not just of spirit." Kenji absorbed these words, a quiet ache growing in his chest. The idea that their profound, spiritual struggle, their readiness for honorable death, was merely a logistical challenge to their adversary was a further devastating blow to his sense of purpose and identity. The camp also had a rudimentary radio, usually playing unfamiliar music for the American guards, but sometimes during the evenings, news broadcasts would crackle through the air. Though Kenji understood little English, he recognized the tone, the rapid-fire delivery of facts and figures. He heard numbers, vast and incomprehensible, describing industrial output, troop movements, distances. Even without understanding the specifics, the sheer volume of information, the casual way these immense figures were presented, painted a picture of a nation operating on a scale that dwarfed his own country's capabilities. He caught glimpses of maps, spread out in the guards' mess hall, showing vast swathes of land, crisscrossed by lines, dotted with names he didn't know. The war for them was not merely a distant struggle in the Pacific, but a global endeavor, managed with a detached, almost bureaucratic precision. This was not the desperate cornered foe of propaganda, but a force of nature, an unstoppable tide.
The internal landscape of Kenji's mind, once a fortress of unwavering conviction, was now crumbling, stone by stone. He continued to pull out the faded photograph of his mother and sister, but its meaning had shifted. It no longer fortified his resolve. Instead, it highlighted the chasm between the world he had left and the bewildering reality he now inhabited. The faces in the photograph, once symbols of a clear purpose, now looked back at him with a silent, questioning gaze.
He wondered what they would think of him now, of the new thoughts that troubled his mind, of the strange beer that had opened his eyes to a different, unsettling truth. He was still a prisoner, but the bars were no longer just those of the fence. They were the invisible barriers of a shattered worldview, trapping him between a past he could no longer fully believe in and a present he did not yet understand. The loneliness deepened, no longer just for certainty, but for a path, a future that made sense. The loneliness deepened, no longer just for certainty, but for a path, a future that made sense. The rigid framework of his youth, meticulously constructed from the Emperor's divine word and the tenets of Bushido, had splintered under the weight of mundane realities. He walked the perimeter of the camp during the brief, allotted exercise times, his gaze drifting beyond the wire, not with a desire for escape, but with a profound, almost desperate curiosity about the unseen world that sustained this bewildering place. He would watch the distant smoke rising from unseen chimneys, the steady stream of vehicles on a faraway road, each element a thread in a tapestry of immense production and organized existence that defied his deepest convictions about the enemy. It was a world of bewildering scale, where even the waste seemed substantial, where the sheer number of prisoners counted and catalogued with detached precision hinted at a conflict far grander and more impersonal than the one he had fought. One day, while queuing for the evening meal, Kenji overheard a fragment of conversation between two American guards. One spoke of a furlough, a temporary leave to return home, to a place called Iowa, where his family awaited. The word, though foreign, carried a universal weight of longing and connection. The guard, a man with tired eyes and a kind face that reminded Kenji vaguely of his own father, spoke of a farm, of harvest, of a child's laughter. It was a brief, unguarded moment, a window into a life that was profoundly ordinary, deeply human, and utterly incompatible with the monstrous image of the enemy he had been taught to despise. This man, who held the power of life and death over them, was also a son, a father, a husband, a farmer. The realization was a subtle, insidious poison to the old hatreds, replacing them with a disquieting sense of shared vulnerability. The camp had a small, open area where prisoners could sit on benches, and sometimes the younger American guard, the one Kenji had observed with the photograph, would sit near the edge of their designated space, playing a small, portable harmonica. The melodies were simple, mournful, sometimes surprisingly upbeat, weaving through the cold autumn air. They were not the martial tunes of his homeland, nor the expected cacophony of a brutal captor. Instead, they were sounds of quiet contemplation, of everyday joy and sorrow. One afternoon, the guard played a tune that resonated with a deep, almost ancient melancholy, a sound that seemed to speak of distant plains and forgotten sorrows. Kenji found himself listening intently, the unfamiliar notes stirring an unexpected ache in his own chest. He caught the guard's eye, and for a fleeting moment, there was no animosity, no barrier of language or uniform, just a shared appreciation for a simple human sound. The guard offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, before his eyes drifted back to the horizon. It was a moment of profound, wordless connection, a bridge built not of words, but of shared emotion, shattering another fragment of Kenji's carefully constructed world. His interactions with Sato, however, grew more strained. Sato, still rigid in his defiance, viewed Kenji's growing curiosity as a weakness, a surrender of spirit. Sato would watch Kenji with a look of silent disapproval, especially when Kenji accepted the occasional offer of American cigarettes or sometimes another bottle of the strange, bitter beer. "Do not forget who you are," Sato had once hissed, his voice low and tight with contempt. "Do not forget what they did." But Kenji was forgetting, or rather, he was unlearning. The memories of atrocity, of the enemy's supposed barbarity, were being slowly, inexorably overwritten by the quiet hum of the camp, the surprisingly warm stew, the soft woolen socks, and the melancholic notes of a harmonica. The old narratives, once so clear and absolute, now felt like fading ink on brittle paper, dissolving in the face of a reality that refused to conform to their harsh lines. He would often retreat to his bunk, pulling out the faded photograph of his mother and sister. What once had been a talisman of unyielding resolve had now become a mirror reflecting his own internal fragmentation. He saw their smiles, but they were not the smiles of an idealized past. They were the smiles of a distant, almost alien world, a world whose certainties he could no longer inhabit. He traced the lines of his mother's face, remembering her teachings of honor and duty, and felt a profound sadness, not for the loss of his freedom, but for the loss of his unquestioning faith. The war, as he had understood it, was a battle of spirits, a clash of ideologies. But here, in this vast, efficient camp, it seemed to be a battle of resources, of logistics, of an almost indifferent power. His spiritual struggle, once the core of his identity, felt diminished, almost irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming practical might. The sheer scale of the American war effort, even glimpsed from within the confines of a prisoner of war camp, was a constant, unsettling revelation. He watched the trains that passed occasionally in the distance, long lines of freight cars stretching to the horizon, laden with materials he could not identify, but which spoke of immense industrial capacity. He saw the vastness of the land, the endless plains that stretched beyond the camp fences, cultivated fields that dwarfed any he had known in his homeland. This was not a nation struggling, but a nation producing, consuming, deploying on a scale that defied comprehension. The propaganda had painted a picture of a decadent, soft enemy, but softness did not build such an empire of industry, and decadence did not sustain such an immense global conflict with such apparent ease. The contrast between his expectations of a desperate, resource-starved foe and the reality of this abundant, almost indifferent power was a constant, gnawing ache. The beer, with its unexpected taste and its casual availability, had been merely the first small crack in a dam that was now slowly, inexorably collapsing. He was adrift in a sea of new perceptions, his compass spinning wildly, no longer pointing to any familiar north. The world outside the wire, once a hostile abstraction, now held a terrifying clarity for Kenji. It was not the demonized land of his youth, but a place of immense indifferent power, feeding its enemies as easily as it waged war. His daily routine became quiet observation. Each meal, distant train, melancholic note from the guard's harmonica, a chisel against his convictions. Sato, hardened by years and pride, remained a stark counterpoint, his silence a bitter accusation. But Kenji saw not capitulation, but survival and a painful awakening. One cold evening, as snow began to drift down, Kenji stared at the distant lights of American towns. He thought of his mother and sister, feeling not patriotic duty, but a profound ache for a world free from ideology. A world where sharing cold beer or listening to a mournful tune meant more than abstract honor or shame. The war had taken everything: his freedom, his understanding of himself. Propaganda promised glory. Reality delivered unsettling normalcy and human complexity. The bitterness of the first sip of beer had faded, replaced by the bitter taste of truth. And so it was, in the quiet solitude of his bunk, holding the crumpled photograph that no longer anchored him to the past, but illustrated its profound distance. Kenji finally understood. The enemy was not monolithic evil. It was individuals capable of destruction and kindness, operating within a system of staggering scale. His own people, for all their fierce spirit, had been outmaneuvered not just by force, but by sheer, relentless abundance. The transformation was complete, a quiet, internal collapse, leaving a void filled with questions and a fragile understanding of a world more nuanced than he had imagined. He was no longer the same soldier, his certainty replaced by a melancholic wisdom, forever marked by the unexpected taste of American beer. In the end, Kenji's journey through the enemy's land was an internal liberation from inherited hatred. His story serves as a poignant reminder. Even amidst conflict, ordinary human interaction, unexpected provision, and the stark contrast between ingrained belief and lived reality can dismantle rigid ideologies. It is a testament to disillusionment clearing the path for discovery and to truth found in unexpected places. Therefore, we invite you to reflect on Kenji's journey. What unexpected truths have challenged your own notions? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history.